Have you ever wanted to use an OEM temperature sensor with an aftermarket ECU, but you have no idea what the calibration values are for that particular sensor? Well, stick around. I'm going to show you how to figure those out. And I'm going to use a whiteboard too, so you know it'll be legit. The subject of this little science experiment is this water temperature sensor from my Mercedes. It's got kind of a unique design. It doesn't have any threads or anything. It has a little O-ring that goes here and it just presses into the block, and then there's a little clip that holds it in. So there's no easy way for me to just replace it with like a GM sensor or some other sensor that I know the values to. So we'll go ahead and use some science and math and figure out what we need to put into the calibration table for this sensor to work with the Holley or with any other aftermarket ECU. Everything I'm going to talk about here goes for pretty much any temperature sensor you're going to find in the engine compartment. Anything that senses fluid or air temperatures is probably a two-wire thermistor type sensor, unless you're dealing with exhaust gas temperatures or really high temps. Then it's a thermocouple, which this does not apply to. But 99% of all the other sensors are probably going to be thermistor. I don't know how to say it, so I'm going to say it both ways randomly throughout this video. The way a thermistor works is it's going to be a two-wire sensor, which you can't really see in here, but if I hook up my little test leads, you'll see that this has just got two wires coming out of it, and they go down inside this bulb here, and inside the copper bulb inside the copper part is a little bulb of semiconductor material, just like a tiny little grain of rice size piece of semiconductor material. And the way it works is as the temperature changes, the resistance in that material goes up or down, and it's inversely proportional. So as the temperature goes up, the resistance goes down, and vice versa. And so it's called an NTC thermistor. That's negative temperature coefficient. A PTC would be positive temperature coefficient, but you don't really find those in automotive applications. So it's an NTC, not to be confused with an NFT. This is not worth $1 million for some strange reason. It's an NTC. Anyway, let me talk a little more about how NTCs work, like the characteristics of how you can plot the graph, and how we'll go about determining a whole range of values for this without having to measure every single one of them. So let's draw a graph of what all the data points would look like if we mapped a whole bunch of data points for different temperatures and different resistance values, because that's essentially what you have to do, and then you input that in as a table in your ECU for your calibration. So spoiler alert, you only need to know the values at two different points. You need to know resistance and temperature at two different points, and you can calculate the rest. And I'll show you how. So remember what I said earlier, it's a negative temperature coefficient, NTC. That means if we put temp on the y-axis, and we have cold down here, and we have hot up here, and we put resistance over here, we have low resistance over here, we have high resistance over here. A data point that is a hot temperature is going to have a low resistance. and a point that has a cold temperature is going to have a high resistance. And if you were paying attention a second ago, you would know that I said you only need 2 points to figure out all the rest of the values. So if we figure this point out and this point out, we probably just draw a straight line, right? Wrong. That's not how it works. It is not a straight linear relationship. What the real line looks like is something more like this. And so the further you get in between these 2 points, if you had just assumed a linear interpolation, the further you are away from these 2 points, the more off you would be. But smart people have figured out the equation for this line, and if you know the any two of the points, the further away they are from each other, the better. So you don't want to pick 2 points that are real close. You pick a hot point and a cold point, and you measure the resistance at those 2 points. Then you can plug it into some equations and figure out every other point on this graph. And luckily there are online calculators that let you just type in some numbers and give you that information. So let me show you how to do that. All you're going to need to do this experiment is the temperature sensor that you want to measure, a digital multimeter so you can measure the resistance through it, and a digital temperature gauge like this, and a pot of water, which I haven't brought out yet. But what we're going to do is we're going to take a pot of water and we're going to stick it in the fridge for a while until it cools down to refrigerator temperature. We're going to bring that pot of water out here and we're going to stick this temperature probe in it, and we're going to read degrees Celsius, and we're going to read the resistance at that temperature, and we're going to write it on the board. Then we're going to take that pot of water back inside. We're going to put it on the stove for a while until it gets hot, like boiling hot or almost boiling, and we're going to bring it back out here and we're going to do the same thing again, and we're going to write the values up here. So we'll have a resistance and temperature for a high temperature, and a resistance and a temperature for a low temperature. And then I'll go onto the computer and show you the calculators where you plug those in to calculate the rest of the values. All right, you can see I got my pot of cold water here, and I've put my temperature probe in there. I'm set to degrees Celsius. Even if you want to do degrees Fahrenheit for your ECU, do it for with Celsius here, because the online calculators that we're going to punch these numbers into want Celsius, and it just makes everything easier. I've got my temperature sensor leads hooked up to the multimeter and set to measure resistance, and I'm just going to kind of hold this here so it doesn't get completely submerged. And wait until it gets stable. And it's better to do this with a fairly large amount of water, because the more thermal mass you have, the slower it's going to change temperature, and it'll make things settle out easier, and it'll make it easier to get an accurate reading on this. But you can see that the temperature has settled at about 11.0 degrees Celsius is what the temperature is. And I'm watching the multimeter over here, and it's still moving. It's at 4.5 kiloohms. And you can tell the temperature sensor is still cooling off because the resistance is still going up. At some point, the resistance will stop going up and level off and start going back down, because the water is going to start warming up as it's sitting out here. So I'm going to wait for it to slow down and maybe even turn around before I take a reading. .63 kiloohms, slowing down. 4.64. 4.65. 4.65. We're still at 11.0 degrees. I think we're going to call it good right there. 4.65 kiloohms at 11 degrees Celsius. So I'm going to write that on my low temperature. 4.65 kiloohms at 11.0 degrees Celsius. And then the next step is to go back inside with my water and heat it up. Come back out and do the same thing with hot water. So stay tuned. I'm back with my hot water. All right, who noticed? Who noticed my screw up? If you noticed that I wrote this in the wrong place earlier, you get a gold star. That one should have been over here because that was the cold water. So now we have a pot of 91 point cooling hot water, and let's see what our resistance is. We're at 2 kiloohms and dropping fast. This will probably be down, yeah, into the hundreds of ohms. We'll wait for the resistance value to settle out and we'll see what the temperature is. This might be a little harder to get a good reading on this one because the temperature is dropping pretty quickly. We're going to wait for that resistance value to slow down and maybe even start creeping back up. That's how we know the temperature sensor is saturated with heat. You don't want to take your reading when they're both dropping because you know that's not right, because remember it's a negative coefficient, so one should be going down as the other goes up. If they're both going the same direction, it just means your sensor is still shedding heat or taking on heat, depending on the scenario. We're at 279 ohms and 85.5 degrees. The resistance values are slowing down. And now they're going back up. So let's say 84.5 to 77.5 ohms. 84.5 to 77.5. 84.5 to 77.5. And we don't really need to do decimal points on the ohms, so that's our resistance and that's our degree C. So there we have our two values. Now we can get on the computer and I'll do a screen share and show you the website where I punch all these numbers in that will give us the graph that we can put into the Holley or whatever other ECU you're using. All right, here we go. The first thing we're going to do is set up a spreadsheet to put these values in and use some automatic calculations to make our lives easier. So I'm going to use Google Sheets, but you can use Excel or whatever you want. I put the values that we measured out in the garage in here. So we had 4.65 kiloohms at 11 degrees Celsius and 277 ohms at 84.5 degrees Celsius. And this is where, if you're an imperialist and you want to use degrees Fahrenheit, where that's going to come into play. I'm going to create the values that are going to ultimately be put into the table in the Holley software. And Holley has 16 values that it holds for doing custom thermistors. So I'm just going to create 16 rows here, and I'm going to have several different columns. The first one I'm just going to do degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to need degrees Celsius. and we're going to need resistance. So let's get those set up. And as far as what values you use, it's kind of up to you. It's what you think your environment is going to need. Typically in an automotive environment, you're going to need temperature. You're going to be measuring temperatures below freezing and above boiling for water. So I'm just going to start with 0 degrees Fahrenheit. And if you do 16 degree increments, it just works out that 16 of those will give you a high value of 240 degrees, which is kind of a, typically high range that we'd want. So you could go higher than this or lower, whatever you want. It's kind of up to you. And then I'm going to use the built-in function in Google Sheets to convert this value from Fahrenheit to Celsius. And then I will spell it right, first of all. And then autofill that down here. And I don't need that many decimal points, so we're just going to shrink it down to 1 decimal point. And we'll do a quick sanity check and make sure that 0 degrees Celsius is 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and 212 Fahrenheit, which would be somewhere right around here, should be about 100. So it looks like I did that right. So now we're set up, and now we need to go find out the resistance values. And for that, I'm going to open up another window here. And I just did a Google search for NTC beta calculator online. And this first one at thinksrs.com that comes up is the one that I'm going to use. You can look through the results, and there are other ones to use, but this one has everything we need and more all in one place. So let me give you a quick description of how to use this, because it's kind of confusing at first, but there's really only a few fields in here that we really need to care about. So you remember I said you only need 2 values to determine the shape of this curve. And that's 2 values if you're using what's known as the beta model. If you use, there's a different model called the Steinhart-Hart model that uses 3 values, and it gives you a little bit more accurate curve. But for our purposes, I'm just going to stick with the simpler one, the beta. And when you're using this calculator, that means you can just ignore R3 and T3 because we're only going to do the first 2. So I'm going to take the values that we determined out in the garage, and I'm going to put in 4650 ohms equates to 11 degrees Celsius. And this is why we did everything in Celsius, because this calculator wants Celsius. And then 277 ohms was 84.5 degrees. And we're going to come over here and we're going to turn off this middle check mark, because that's the Steinhart-Hart, which uses this 3rd value, which we're not going to enter. So we're going to get rid of that. That way we don't have to see it, and it makes our curve look nice. And so this is the curve that I showed you earlier, although the axes are flipped, but it's still generally the same shape. And now that we put R1, R2, T1, T2 in here, it's calculated this beta value, which there's a lot of math that goes on behind the scenes to calculate this beta value, and then this beta value is used when we start entering stuff over here to come up with the values. But that's all built into this tool, so we don't have to get into the math. All we have to do is start entering values from our table here, which we've got negative 17.8 degrees C. We're going to actually type that in here, negative 17.8. And when we do that and hit enter, you see it gives us a calculated resistance. And we're going to type that value over here, only we're going to round up or down to the nearest ohm. We don't need decimal points, so it's going to be 21,864. And then we're going to do the same thing over and over again until we fill this table. So negative 8.9 degrees Celsius gives us 13,072, and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill all these in and fast forward the video until I get to the end. And there you have it. We now have a table with 16 values with degree Fahrenheit running from below freezing to well above boiling, and we have the corresponding resistance values. So I can go enter this into the Holley software, and at this point I can ignore the degree C because I'm going to put it in Fahrenheit. So I can punch that into the Holley and I should be good to go. Now, what if you want to prove that this process works, and if so, how well does it work? To do that, I wanted to do that, so I happen to have a Rife liquid temperature sensor sitting around, and that comes with the calibration values from the factory. So what I decided to do was run this same experiment on that sensor and see if I could work backwards and come into the same settings that they had published using my little experiment here. So I set up a table just like I did for the other sensor, except for this time instead of 16 values I went to 32 or however many it is, because this is what their calibration sheet has. It starts at -20 Fahrenheit and goes to 290. So I wanted to try and back into the same values that they had, so I used the same starting point. And again, I converted it to Celsius because I went and put each one of these values into this calculator, and it came up with my resistance value. And so after I did that, I also added to this sheet the values from the Rife data sheet, and these are the resistance values that they have for each of these temperatures. And you'll see that they're in the ballpark with mine, but they're not exactly the same, which I wouldn't expect them to be exactly the same. But the fact that they're trending the right way and they're more or less close is a good sign. But I wanted to see how close they were, and so I worked all the way out to the temperature that Rife would say that this resistance has, and when at -20 Fahrenheit, which is -28.8 Celsius. And then I did the difference between what I calculated and what their sheet said it should be in degrees Celsius and in degrees Fahrenheit. And if you look at this column J here, degrees Fahrenheit difference is kind of what I'm going for, because that shows how far off my calculations were in degrees Fahrenheit from what Rife said they should be. And you can see here at the really cold temperatures, I was off by almost a full degree. I was a degree under, but as the temperatures warmed up, I get closer and closer, and then I was pretty much right on the money right here at 120 degrees Fahrenheit. And then as I continue up the scale, I got off by a little more in the higher ranges, where the worst was here at 290 degrees. I was off by 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit, which overall, I think that's pretty darn close, considering all I did was take 2 temperature points to calculate this. And you know, if you're dealing with 280, 290 degree temperatures, being off by 1.8 degrees, that's not really, I don't even know if that's within the error of margin for the sensor. In the automotive environment, you care like 5 degrees, 10 degrees difference. So I wouldn't want to be off by like 5 or 10 degrees. But being off by 1.8 or down here less than 1 at the extreme ends of the scale, I consider that pretty good. And sort of here in the meat of the scale, where you spend most of your operating temperature time, it was really within a few tenths. So that gives me good a good feeling that the values I came up with for my Mercedes sensor are going to give me pretty good coolant temperature values. So I'm going to go ahead and use them. Well, I hope you found that helpful. If you did, it'd be great if you'd share this video and let other people know about it. And if you've actually used this methodology on your own sensor, put some comments down below and just tell us how well it worked for you and maybe what you were working on. It's always interesting to hear what other types of things people are working on. As far as I know, I've got the only Mercedes in the world that's controlled by a Holley EFI. But who knows? Maybe you have one too, or something even more interesting. So give us a share and a like, and let us know in the comments if this was useful. See you next time.